Now, why did I choose the topic turning points? It does have some meaning to me, I think particularly for two reasons. The first is, I think, in my view, life isn't about a sort of aimless walk in the park just to enjoy things that you come across. Neither should it be a case of being lost in a maze where you walk around looking for something and you can't find where you want to go. In fact, I also don't think, metaphorically, life should be climbing towards a peak of excellence. I don't think people, when they start out in life, even know what that peak is, much less how to get there. I think life is really about a journey very much in search of a purpose. The first turning point in my life, that's a cute-looking kid, right? When I was young, when I was born up to about 6 years old, I spent probably more than half my time actually in hospitals. I was an asthmatic when I was young. I lived in Thailand, and at that time there was no such thing as Ventolin, Seretide, and so on. I was asthmatic because I was allergic to mosquito repellents, but my parents never knew. So I was in and out of hospitals. I think the first turning point lesson here at a very young age is actually the answer to the question, why me? And that's a very simple answer. Why not me? Why should any of us be so special in the world to be blessed? Why can't disasters and misfortunes affect us like it affects other people? And I think the sort of awakening you have when you realize that at a very young age is that you just accept whatever life gives to you and you just move on. The second turning point was actually quite a long time later, when I was about 16 years old, 10 years later, and I was at that time a teenager already. You see this teenager filled with angst, right? A lot of angst. I discovered since the age of 16, when I started asking why, that to me, the most liberating and yet the most dangerous, the most revolutionary three-letter word in the English language is why. Asking why is the fundamental reason for how people become leaders. It is what separates the leaders from the followers. Disruption, innovation, and progress does not occur without asking the question, why? For me personally, asking the question, why, has probably been the single most important reason for two things in my life. One, getting thrown out of university, getting thrown in jail, and for whatever moderate success I've had. And from there, I became a student activist. This is me on the verge of getting thrown out of Stanford University. From my high school years until university, I think from about 18 to 25 probably were the most transformative periods of my life. I have the rare accolade, I'll have you know, that Stanford has graduated about 300,000 students. They have only kicked out 5 people, and I am one of them. So my life changed because I accompanied some black students to a debate that they wanted to challenge a Nobel Prize winner, William Shockley, who won the Nobel Prize for inventing the transistor. And the transistor was way the precursor to chips and so on. But he invented it, and he got a Nobel Prize, and he also happened to believe in eugenics. Eugenics is the science and the study of breeding people. And he had this theory that people should be bred for the genetic traits. So he had this big campaign about how African Americans should not be allowed to reproduce, and so on. So the black students went to his class to disrupt him, and I was sitting there like I always do, minding my business, very capo. And they said, hey Ho, we're going to disrupt this class, why don't you come along? So of course I said, I'll come along. I went to the class, they raised a lot of placards, they disrupted it, and so William Shockley, knowing this would happen, took out his Polaroid camera, took some pictures, and essentially after that he reported the whole bunch to what was called the Campus Judicial Panel. And disruption of free speech, which is disruption of a classroom, is the biggest no-no at Stanford University. So I was the Chinaman who got spotted, and I got kicked out. And after that, William Shockley actually came to me and said, Mr. Ho, and I remember he called me Mr. Ho, and I said, Professor Shockley, and he said, I know you've been kicked out, it's most unfortunate, you haven't read my book. I said, no, I didn't read your book. He said, well, you should have read page 54, I'm going to give you the book. And page 54 says that Jews and Chinese are the most intelligent people in the world, should be bred more intensively. So if you read the book, you wouldn't have protested. So that's another irony, that's an irony of life, right? Things happen to you, that you have no reason why, they just happen. So I was kicked out, and the turning point for me, though, that I think on the serious side, was that all my life, up to then, I grew up in Thailand, and I could be called what people call banana. You're yellow outside, but you're white inside. I was completely educated in Thailand, in an American school. My father was Singaporean for 5 generations, and by virtue, only by virtue of him being the Singapore ambassador to Thailand, and technically and legally, our house in Thailand was sovereign Singapore territory. And every day for 2-3 years, I raised a Singapore flag up a flagpole. But other than that, I had never known Singapore. So at the age of about 18, 19, when I was kicked out of Stanford, I was immediately accepted to the university which I had originally applied for, which was Cornell University. And my sister was there, my parents were educated there. And so I could go to Cornell. And actually, one part of me wanted very much to go on to Cornell, because that was a life I was used to. A student activist, pretty easygoing, upper middle class family, go to your classes, disrupt classes. But I really knew in my heart of hearts that this was just playing a game. And that if I really wanted to be serious about what I believed in life, then really I should come back to Singapore, but not come back to Singapore. I should actually undergo national service, for which I had the necessary deferments, and really leave this life in a country which I was very comfortable with, but which I never really identified with. It was a very difficult decision, and I think that was probably the first decision I've made in my life at the age of 19, where I've made a decision that was right, but probably the most personally painful. And nowadays, when I give talk on leadership, both to my colleagues or to other people, I actually tell them, try to think of your own life and the decisions you made, small or big, which were the right decisions, but were the most painful. Decisions even like, I remember one young person telling me, this was a cadet at West Point in America, and he said at the age of 20-something that he had such an experience, and that was having the dilemma of whether to report to his superiors or not that his classmate was cheating because of the code of conduct that he subscribed to, but at the same time, the friendship he had with his close friend. I think it is when you encounter such dilemmas in your own life, having to make decisions which you know in your heart of hearts, you know that's a right decision, but it's so painful to make. And when you make those and you learn from them, you're able to, in the future, make more and more decisions which are right, but which are painful. And I'll never forget the lonely moments I walked around at Stanford. The school had ended, and I was so torn to just continue my carefree life as a student activist, or to go to a country which I'd never lived in Singapore. I came back, not to a good life. Straight away, had my hair cut, went into boot camp in Sentosa, which is not what it is today. It was actually Plakamati at that time. And I was immediately called Jakartan by all the English ed. But the Chinese educated actually took me in. And although I was perhaps more westernized than anyone else, they really took me in. And I really began to understand, beginning from the cleavages that we have in Singapore society. This is way back in the 70s. We have a lot less of it now today because of the fact that all young Chinese now, both English and Chinese speaking, but not in the older days. That was my introduction into Singapore. Then, of course, I should have just been a very good Singaporean. I should have just let life easily and learned the lesson I should have learned, getting kicked out of Stanford. My parents were praying I would have learned that lesson. But no, the next one then, I became a political detainee. So it's kind of like from the from the frying pan into the fire itself. This was 6 years later, So what happened was I went into NS, and I actually liked national service so much, I almost signed on quite seriously, because I actually didn't have a university degree, and they were offering me that if I signed on, I could be a captain pretty quickly, and so on and so forth. I almost signed on. My mother persuaded me not to, and I was then had the choice of whether to go on to NUS or to go back to Stanford or to Cornell. Now, today, American universities are considered to be good universities, the Ivy League schools and so on. Stanford is considered to be a great university now. Of course, after LKY said it's where he would have sent his children. Before that, it was like really not a place to go. I had attended 3 years at Stanford in economics. Many of the textbooks I was using were written by professors whose textbooks were being used in NUS. I applied for NUS to be a transfer student with all the grades and recommendations from the teachers in Stanford, and NUS said, no way. American universities, we do not recognize. So again, I was torn between just going back and finishing 1 year at Stanford or starting all over from year 1 but with NUS. And of course, that was to me an important turning point. It was, in a way, I think, both a right and a wrong reason. My wife isn't here tonight, but if you ever see her and you know her, do tell her that I said the right reason for why I accepted to stay on in Singapore was that was the only way I got to meet Claire, right? So I did meet her that way. She was doing her honors degree, her honors thesis in NUS, and I was a freshman. She was really doing honors, having way graduated, but I was a mature student. That was the good part, going there. Otherwise, I would never have met Claire. The not so good part was I had to start as year 1. And starting from year 1, it's pretty boring. I hadn't had anything to do, so I started wanting to make some money. I didn't live at home with my parents. I rented a place outside. I had to pay the rent. So I started writing. Writing for Far Eastern Economic Review. And one thing led to another, and wham, I got detained as a pro-communist. I was detained under the ISA. I'm the only businessman today who actually is an ex-political detainee, which is another nice thing to have. But I was detained as a political detainee, and I had to confess on television and so on and so forth. The point here about this whole tumultuous period, there is a lesson and there is a turning point. And the political detention taught me one thing. It was a turning point and a lesson that whatever you do, there are serious consequences. So whatever you choose to do in life, do not think of it as a light decision. The reason that came to me was because when you're detained as a detainee, you're told you can be here for life. And there have been detainees, like Lim Chin Siong and others, and whether you agree with them or not, and I think Lee Kuan Yew himself has said he's always respected Lim Chin Siong for his integrity, for his tenacity. He understood the consequences when he undertook the politics that he did and the directions that he went, that he might be detained for life. And he took it without bitterness, that this is part of parcel of what you do. I think I had been playing all along a game. I've been a student activist in Stanford. I had been writing a lot of things and so on. But that was a waking up, not about whether I was right or wrong. Up to this day, I'll say openly that I don't think I deserve to be detained, and I do not think I was a communist, etc. But I do not blame the government of the day for what they did, because there were threats at that time. But I'll never admit that I think I was wrong. But I would openly say that I entered into all of this as a young person, not really knowing that there are consequences to what you choose to do. And that was the turning point for me then, was a clear decision to get out of all this student activism, political activism, and to essentially leave that life altogether. After that, I left. Oh, the other turning point, of course, that was so good. The other good point about my detention was that it was the source of my marriage proposal. I hope you all agree afterwards that it was very romantic. If you ask Claire, she'll tell you it's the most unromantic marriage proposal. But compared to nowadays when kids, take pictures of each other and videos and fly to different countries. When I was in detention, even after I confessed and everything, my parents could see me, could visit me at the Whitley Road prison. But my girlfriend could not, because she had no legal status. She was just a girlfriend. So when I got released and we were together again, I said, hey, next time I go to jail, you can see me, we get married, you know. So she said, what do you mean? I said, well, you know, if we're married, you can see me in jail. So how about we get married? She didn't think that was very romantic. But it's pretty unique, right? So she did marry me. I didn't go to jail again, not yet. And so we left Singapore, we went to Hong Kong, and I decided to start a new life. And that is, in fact, a completely new life after there. I went to Hong Kong and rejoined the Far Eastern Economic Review, not writing about politics, not writing about Singapore, but writing about economic development. It was a great time, but journalists in Hong Kong are paid pretty badly. They're paid worse than, what do you call them, hairdressers. Probably in Singapore, journalists are even paid worse than hairdressers too. You'd have to ask Jean Yip that, but hairdressers were paid better than journalists. We could not afford to live on Hong Kong Island or on Kowloon, so we went to a very poor fishing village called Lama Island. And we lived in a little village in Lama Island called Yong Shui Wan, which means Banyan Tree Bay. And we really were quite poor. I remember always about the hairdressers because buildings in Hong Kong on the islands had 3 stories. The owner would live on the ground floor. He would rent out the middle floor to a tenant, and the richer tenants would be renting the 3rd floor with the sun deck, the rooftop. So the rooftops were all occupied by hairdressers, Vidal Sassoons and so on. And, you know, poor journalists would occupy the middle floor. So we were there for about 2.5, 3 years. They were not at all well-off years. There were no cars. We had to always run every day to the ferry point to catch a ferry. But as young newlyweds, we were very much in love, and it was very much an idyllic life. And in fact, I digress a bit here, but in fact, when later on it was time to name the resort business that we were going to build, we didn't want to name it after just something like cocoa palms or seashells or something silly like that. We wanted something evocative of the values that we wanted to stand for. The values of romance, intimacy, being together with people that you love, and so on. So that's how the name Banyan Tree Bay, the name Banyan Tree came about, because we lived in Banyan Tree Bay. There I lived for about 3 years or so, and I decided, having given up any kind of political aspirations or any aspirations to change the world, I wanted to be an academic of all things. And I actually had gotten an offer to go to INSEAD, the business school, to be a research fellow. And I was actually going to go there. On the way there, and suddenly my father had a stroke. And my father had long had a family business in Thailand. And so at the age of 29, I was the eldest son, not the eldest child, but the eldest son. So I left Hong Kong, left the idea of being an academic, and with absolutely no business degree, no idea of business at all, and having promised Claire that I would never be a businessman, because she had made me make that promise, because we both didn't like business people in our youth, being very radical activists. I became a business person. So at the age of 29, I came back. I joined the family business, and I must say that it has been a very important and a very meaningful turning point for me. And then again, I didn't know it when it was just a natural decision. I would come back because I was the eldest son and my father had a stroke. So I came back. And for one reason, a number of reasons, but for one reason, it has been one of the most valuable periods of my life, because although my father had the first of many strokes, which eventually killed him, and although he was not well already after the first stroke, for the next 5 or 6 years, I got to work together with my father. And that's truly a blessing. And I now I work with 2 of my children who are in the business. And it's not just the issue of succession. It's the issue of really learning to respect someone who is also your parent at the same time. It's not always pleasant. There are a lot of tensions, but it was a really lovely period. So I was thrust into business, and I stayed in that business for 10 years. In the 10 years there, I discovered a number of things I wasn't happy about in business as a whole. And I realized that essentially the main thing I wasn't happy about was that Asian businesses in those days were always competing on the basis of just being cheaper than other people. We could provide cheaper labor, but we did not have any companies that would own the customer. Now everybody talks about brands, and a lot of successful brands coming from Singapore and China, but this is way back in the 1980s. I made a decision that if I were to ever start a business of my own, I wanted it to be a successful brand. I wanted to start a brand that could come from Asia and could be respected from around the world as an Asian brand. And I wanted that in particular because in those days we were doing contract manufacturing. We had factories that would assemble televisions for Matsushita, we would be making shoes for Nike, but we would always be making things for other people. We didn't own the customer, we didn't own the brand. So that was a decision I made, and then subsequent to that, we formed Banyan Tree. We came across in the mid-1980s, I came across a piece of land in Phuket, which was an abandoned tin mine, and we bought it for a lark, didn't know what we wanted to do with it, but essentially I became an amateur hotelier, an accidental hotelier. So from 29 to 39 years old, I was managing our father's business, which is still currently being managed today. It's a thriving business my eldest son is doing. But at the age of 39, which is pretty old, at around 40, I started a completely new business. I knew nothing about the hotel industry. Neither did I have a particular desire to go into the hotel industry. But because we came across this piece of land, we bought, and then we built a hotel, then second hotel, third hotel, I became a hotelier. And the moral of that story is, you never know, again, what you are going to do in life. To me, the moral of that story, in fact, is that for a lot of people, when business success is never about pure intention. People who tell you that, oh, I'm a great business success because I knew from day one I was going to do this or do that. Half the time, these people are telling you a half-truth, and they're telling it to you in retrospect. The reality of life is that a successful business and a successful business person usually has to combine two attributes. One is luck, and the other one is intent. Here I had luck. We came across by chance this piece of land which got me into the hotel business by luck. But intent was always there to use that opportunity and to build a brand. So that was one of probably the more important turning points. And along the way, of course, I had gotten a family and so on. And these are all important milestones, but milestones are not turning points. Turning points to me are when you could have chosen one direction, but you didn't, and you went another way, and that has made all the difference. The final turning point, I think, is this one. At the age of 45, in 1997, having spent quite a bit of my life criticizing university education, criticizing education in general, you know what teachers always do to you, right? If you're the critic in the class, they always tell you, okay, you get the job. Since you criticize, you go and solve the problem. That was what DPM Tony Tan did. He said, since you've been always the one criticizing our system, you go and start a university. So I was landed with the job of starting SMU. A highly unlikely position for me. I've not got an MBA. I have a very basic NUS degree, have been kicked out of university and so on. But I think what I did have was convictions about what education should be about. I do not have the necessary skill sets, but I had values, and I had a philosophy, and I had a worldview. And I think the lesson here for all of us is that when these turning points happen to you in life, you have to decide whether you want to grab it or not. I was thinking of turning it down on the grounds that I know nothing about education. How could I deal with 300 professors all with PhDs and so on? But the point in life here is that if you have something that you truly believe in enough, and you do ever have the opportunity to act upon it, seize the day. Do not ever say, I don't know what to do, other people know how to do it better. Believe in yourself and believe that if you have something to say, say it. If you have something to do, do it. That was 20 years ago, and life has, of course, changed for me. That's the last turning point. Interesting point here, if you see, is that for the last 20 years, there have been no other turning points. There have been very important milestones for me, but not turning points. Because after the age of 45 onwards, my life was set. I had found my purpose in life, my goals, and then it becomes mainly a case of wanting to go out and do better what you can do. So in conclusion, I just wanted to say that to me, turning points are very important. We have to be mindful all along, even as we're older. I do not know today, at my age, whether there will be something else that may happen that will allow me to make a choice of this way or that way. But I think we all have to be open to the idea that little decisions we make have turning points. Life is about turning points all the time. Life is full of potential turning points. And the whole idea about mindfulness, the concept of mindfulness, which is from a Buddhist concept that deals with meditation, is the idea that whatever we do in life, there should be always a part of you that's looking down on yourself, as if you're observing yourself, so that you are not just mindlessly going through life, but very mindfully seeing what every decision you make is important for you. I think I've actually said more than enough, boring the rest of you. I wanted to thank you for your giving mercy to me. I've spoken about my life in ways I've never done to anybody else. I've shown pictures of me. I want to show you the sickly 6-year-old kid. Don't you feel sorry for this little kid? That one there, do you see? Between the guy who's talking on the microphone and the other guy who's there in the blue shirt, there's a guy there who's 24 years old. This is a screen grab that Straits Times had of my confession at 24 years old to being a communist, which you can see today I'm not exactly a communist. But the whole point is, I think all of us could assemble a montage like this. And it's important sometimes to have these montages for yourselves and to look back on your own life and to say, what were the turning points in my life? How did I live my life? And were the turning points that led me to a greater search for meaning and for purpose? Some of you may have heard of a writer and a philosopher, psychologist, who was called Viktor Frankl, who wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. And it was about the Holocaust in Austria and in Germany, the Nazi period when he lost all his family, and he survived it. And that was because he realized that, and he became a psychologist dealing with people. And his main thesis was that all of us are in search of meaning. And when I talk about in search of purpose, I emphasize this. It's not the P, it's not the capital P that's important. It's the small p. Purpose doesn't mean you're going to be Mother Teresa. You're going to become the Prime Minister of Singapore. Having purpose means, to me, being able to wake up every day with joy, with excitement, because there's something that you're excited about. It could be your grandchildren, it could be a hobby, it could be helping out at the mayor's CDC. All these things give us purpose. And it's the purpose with a small p that I think is really, really important.